Hey, it's your host Xavier here. Last episode, I promised that we'd talk about the surveying of the Manhattan street grid in New York City. That story shares a lot of historical connective tissue with Thomas Jefferson's nationwide survey grid. But, unfortunately, I realized the story I was telling didn't have room for such a lengthy digression. Anyway, if you're still interested in hearing that story, I've got good news. We'll be covering it in the first bonus episodes of Chicagoland. For just $5 a month, you can listen to all the Chicagoland bonus episodes as they come out. That's way cheaper than Disney+. I mean, they do have the Ewoks animated series, so I guess I see the value proposition. But seriously, putting together an episode of Chicagoland takes days of research, writing, and preparation even before we get to recording or editing audio. It's really important to me to be clear-eyed and honest about our history, and to actually understand the places that we inhabit. If you think that's a valuable mission, then really consider subscribing to Chicagoland on Patreon. Just a word of warning to iPhone owners: if you subscribe to Chicagoland on your iPhone, do not pay inside the Patreon app. Apple charges 30% extra for all subscriptions on the app and then pockets the fee. Just go to patreon.com/Chicago_land on the Safari app and pay there instead. Now let's get back to the show that you came here for. Despite his failed attempt at trying to define a universal unit of length, Jefferson continued to imagine a mathematically defined United States. Since America was now independent, the proclamation line through the Appalachians was null and void. How, then, would the new land be organized? Jefferson started with the states. The first issue to tackle was that most of the eastern states had land claims that extended westward, often indefinitely across the continent. If new western states were going to be formed, the existing states were going to have to be convinced to surrender their claims. This eventually did happen, with Connecticut being the last holdout.
Oh, because all the colonies sort of had
Yeah, they
had
just kind of
ideas
had
of
lines of latitude that they just kind of traced west across the whole continent in most cases. They just hadn't gotten to dealing with it yet.
sure. Yeah, okay.
So here's Jefferson's sort of idea of how states might be divided in the Western Territories. Or the Northwestern Territories, as they become known.
Okay, that just does not look at Michigan. What is that?
It's a grid.
It's okay. Yeah, no, this sort of illustrates the issues with applying a grid to natural formations.
It sort of does, yes. Jefferson proposed lines of latitude and longitude he thought should be the boundaries of the new states. He suggested a total of 16 states in a 2 by 8 square grid. Actually, one of the 16 would have been the eastern corner of Ohio, which is labeled Washington, the state of Washington.
Yeah, Jefferson literally just looked at a map of Michigan and was like, what would make most sense here? Like cutting off the last little bit of this on the left and having that be part of the state across the lake.
I'm also not clear
with
what state that
no
belongs
connecting
to.
land.
Yeah, as Michigan today famously has no non-contiguous portions. Yes.
Um, it's better than this.
It's better than this. So Jefferson's idea was to get settlers into these square states as quickly as possible and to join them to the Union. He was using the phrase Empire of Liberty to describe his utopian republic, which would be made up of white yeoman farmers, that he imagined populating these western states. The empire part really emphasizes that Jefferson's Utopia project is really built on expansion, exploitation of natural resources, and extirpation or assimilation of natives.
The Empire of Liberty has such a ring to it.
It has such a ring to it. The Empire of Liberty.
Wait, what exactly was he planning on like the Gulf Coast there?
He may not have been thinking about it. This is also not territory that the United States had. That would be Louisiana Purchase territory, mostly.
Hmm.
Certainly the west of the
Oh,
Mississippi.
I see.
But I think he was like thinking of starting with the northern states there, Midwestern states today.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what's your favorite King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard album, and why is it Polypotamia land?
Polygondwana land?
Polypotamia land.
Oh. Polypotamia land.
Polypotamia land.
Oh yeah, turn off the lines. Polypotamia land, yes.
There we go. There it is. So it was
Yeah.
it was in the smaller divisions of the states that Jefferson's plan got really ambitious. He called for dividing all the new land into a 10 by 10 mile grid, with each square being called a hundred. That's because each hundred would be divided up 100 ways to make 100 1 square mile plots of land. You got that? So inside the states, they're going to be divided up into squares called hundreds, and each hundred is going to be divided up into 100 little 1 by 1 squares.
And these, of course, are one new American mile.
Yes.
Squares.
So they would have been 6,886 feet and 4 inches on each side instead of 5,280. The mathematical elegance of Jefferson's proposal was that the 1 by 1 mile lots of land fitted neatly inside the square hundreds, which themselves fit neatly inside the square states. So an ideal square state would be a 12 by 12 grid of hundreds. So 12 hundreds would fit across, making a total of 144 hundreds inside a single state, and each of those has 100 lots of land.
Incredibly rational.
So rational, it didn't happen. Specifically, James Monroe was opposed to the idea of small states. As a fellow Virginia plantation owner and an influential member of the Democratic Republican Party, he did not want to see the southern states losing their relative power in Congress. And actually, many politicians didn't want to see the eastern states in general lose their influence.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, Congress opted to carve out just 5 future states in the Northwest Territory. Those would become Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And no Polypotamia.
No Michigania?
No Michigamia.
Sylvania.
Just Sylvania.
The Northwoods
I love
are
the fact that there's
Sylvania.
already a Pennsylvania, and now you're naming a new state Sylvania.
Oh my god.
But it is true. That is where a lot of old-growth forests came from.
Yeah.
So none of the specifics of Jefferson's plans actually got implemented. The new states didn't even attempt to be squares. The country never adopted the metric American mile, and when the land surveys started, they used 6-mile-long edges instead of the 10-mile-long ones. Still, Jefferson's
Fuck Jefferson.
What?
Fuck Jefferson.
Oh, fuck Jefferson. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
The first Survey Congress commissioned would become the basis for the Public Land Survey System, which would come to cover most of the United States over the next 150 odd years. The man that we placed in charge of the first grid-based survey in the Northwest Territory was named Thomas Hutchins. Hutchins was actually a big name in surveying at the time because he had been one of 2 official geographers to the United States. The other geographer to the United States had been Simeon DeWitt, who will join our story again alongside Gouverneur Morris when we talk about Manhattan. I'm having trouble finding a lot of information about the office of geographer to the United States, but it seems like it was mostly a wartime office involved with making maps for the Continental Army. Then after the war, they just let both men continue to have the title. Since DeWitt had revoked the title of geographer to the United States, in order to continue his surveying work for the state of New York, Congress sent Hutchins to survey Ohio. The eastern starting point is the spot where the borders of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia converge. Although back then West Virginia was still part of Virginia. The theory was that the
Still
survey
one big
team
Virginia.
would start the survey by making a baseline due west from the starting point, and then they would append additional vertical lines perpendicular and south of the baseline. Where is this? They were essentially surveying a wedge of land between the baseline to the north and the bank of the Ohio River to the south. So actually, let's take a look at right here.
What was the chain?
Sorry? Oh, the chain's
What was
important.
the
The chain's
chain?
important. So this is the area they were surveying. It's part of eastern Ohio.
Oh, okay. That's the Ohio River?
The Ohio River to the east.
The Ohio River to the east. And
south.
that's just very, very regular squares.
Regular squares.
Very regular squares that then like overrun on another river.
What?
Very regular squares that then like just
Yes.
completely do not respect the further river.
They do not respect the further river. So the main tool for doing these surveying tasks was called the Gunter chain. Edmund Gunter was an Englishman who'd invented it around a century earlier. It's made up of 100 links that are all the same length, and they add up to 66 feet. So when two chainmen hold each end of the chain taut, they know that there's exactly 66 feet between them. So ironically, Jefferson's ideally rational grid was being measured using whatever traditional measurement units from the old world were just lying around. This is how you measure things. This is what they used.
Yeah, use the tools you got.
Yeah, absolutely. To measure distances longer than 66 feet, the chainmen needed to stretch the chain out multiple times. The way they do that is similar to how an inchworm caterpillar walks. So an inchworm walks by pulling its back legs up to where its front legs are, then it pushes off from its back legs to push its front legs forward again and stretches out all the way. So in order to measure multiple chains in a row, the chain man in the back moves up to the chain man in the front, and then the chain man in the front can pull the chain taut again. They continue doing this all day. And how do you keep the chains straight for miles upon miles? The surveyor uses a magnetic compass to find a landmark in the distance to aim toward. And then the axemen, yes, axemen, chop down every tree in the path of the chainmen.
Okay.
Axemen are purported to be very swole.
Yeah.
If the ground...
Did they have to wait for the Axeman to like do all the chains like before they even start?
No. They were all part of a single unit that was moving across the countryside.
Got it.
If the ground isn't flat, then the chainmen need to hold the downhill part of the chain up horizontally to keep the distance consistent. And I should point out that the survey team started by measuring land on the Allegheny Plateau. So, like, it's not the steepest part of Appalachia, but, like, it's definitely full of hills, very forested, and with lots of eroded valleys and streams.
Cool. Do they have, like, a pole for like, holding the chain aloft?
I don't know.
Or did they just, like, get up as tall as possible?
It stands to reason there must have been poles for this purpose, but I do not know. I did not learn anything about that.
What are the little... Oh, there's 10 little markers in the chain.
Yes, there are 9 markers on the chain to indicate every time you've done 10 links, and then obviously like the ends are the ends. And I think it's cute that they can't count them. There's like 1 prong, 2 prongs, 3 prongs.
Yeah, so you know where you are in it.
Yeah.
And then you just got to see which one you're closer to.
For measuring distances less than 66 feet, which I don't know why anyone would ever want.
And so that you get a nice marker every 6.6 feet, which lines up to fuck you inches.
That's correct. So, The surveyor and the chainmen and the axemen would work as a team going chain by chain across the landscape. Every 80 chains,
7.2.
every 80 chains added up to a mile, and then they would place a monument at each mile. So monument in this context is a technical term, meaning whatever type of marking the surveyors happened to use to mark off the mile. They're not grand. They could be a wooden stake or a blazing mark on a tree or a pile of rocks. Later on, this got a lot more standardized. Usually there's a metal rod driven into the ground, and then it's got like a little cap that sticks out. You might recognize these. So that's a public land survey system monument. So the part that you see is just the cap on top of the stake.
Cool.
Then the surveying team would have to repeat all of that 5 more times to reach 6 miles.
Does 66 feet divide evenly into a mile, or?
Yeah, I think it does, because it has to be 80 for a mile.
80 times 66. 5280. All right.
It's got one job. That's its job.
It makes a lot more sense now.
Yes. So if you're traveling north or south, the 6-mile distance is called a township. If you're traveling east or west, that distance is called a range. This is very confusing because in most Midwestern states, the entire 6 by 6 mile square becomes the sub-county administrative division called a township. So I'm going to be careful to refer to range lines and township lines as opposed to the actual township, which is that 6 by 6 mile grid, or a 6 by 6 mile square.
So a township is a one township by one range.
Yes. Square. A township is measured in one township by one range,
which are the same distance.
Which are the same distance, hopefully. Often not. Anyway, the survey team was supposed to measure out 13 ranges along the baseline according to the orders they got from Congress, which would be a distance of 78 miles. Then the township lines could be measured from the baseline south. Mm-hmm. In fact, Hutchins' survey ended up being a bit abortive. Their first foray in 1785 only lasted 2 weeks because they got spooked by a raid on a nearby trading post on the Tuscarawas River. So most of the people living in this area at this time were Lenape, Miami, Shawnee, or Ottawa. And the surveyors were obviously agents of colonial expansion. They'd be an obvious target.
Yeah, if you have strangers walking around in your yard, chopping down
cutting straight lines,
it's a bit suspicious, I'd say.
It's suspicious behavior. So they retreated east to Pittsburgh after doing just 4 miles of the baseline. That's not even one range. They tried again in 1786, and this time they finished the first 4 ranges, so that's 24 miles. And they got started on some of the township lines. Congress got fed up with how slow the survey was going and told them just to finish the 7 ranges and be done. So that finished in 1787, and that's why the first grid survey is usually called the 7 ranges. So that's this again. What can you tell me about the 7 ranges?
It is roughly it's taller than it is wide.
It sure is.
Again, it kind of cuts across all the rivers that it isn't based on.
Uh-oh, I made a mistake. Yes, it cuts across all the rivers it is not. There's only one river that it's taking into account. The Ohio River.
It's kind of Illinois shaped. The squares are they're a bit slanted.
They're a little bit slanted, yes. They get more and more slanted the further out you get from the beginning.
Wait a minute. How did that happen? Or was it just sort of... Is there like a... Is this like due to them using compass and...
Yeah, well, if it turns out you start in one place and then you just try to make a really straight line for miles and miles and miles, and then you try to make like perpendicular straight lines from there from miles and miles and miles, It's just,
Then you're not always going to get straight lines and perpendicular angles.
I think they're technologically limited. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing to notice is that about half of the township squares were not immediately sold off. They were retained by the national government. Although I don't,
Those are the ones with that don't have all the bits in them.
the ones that aren't divided up 36 ways, exactly.
And are the ones that are seem to have a larger square in the middle?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's for. I'm not sure what that indicates. But yeah, so we have like alternating bands of townships that were sold off to private buyers versus townships that were retained by the government for future use. So at this point, I need to back up a little to cover political developments in the U.S. after the Revolutionary War. I glossed over this earlier when I was talking about Jefferson's plan for the Western states and his particular ideology. But there was another really important motivation for westward expansion in the 1700s. The United States was, in fact, totally broke. One of the really contentious issues for the early Confederation was how or even whether to pay off all of its war debt. This was a rocky period in domestic politics as the property-owning middle class, who were more or less the leaders of the war, attempted to reconcile with the working class rank and file, and I mean that literally. These are the people who had filled out the bulk of the Continental Army. There was a big question about how the new government could pay the wages for all the soldiers who had fought in the war. Mostly, soldiers were promised their wages in the future after the war was won. Well, now the war was won, and the Continental Congress, later the Congress of the Confederation, as well as the states, were all deeply in debt. But one thing the U.S. had a lot of was territory, at least in theory. Yeah. The old 1763 proclamation was irrelevant now. Americans were free to survey land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Several land fundraising schemes in the Northwest Territory were organized, mostly in Ohio. And the Northwest Territory, I think I explained this before, but it's the name used for the area north and west of the Ohio River.
So that's what this is their money-making scheme.
Yeah, this is like the easternmost part of the Northwest Territory that we're looking at right now.
But this is like part of their attempt to like get some money in the door coming in.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few different ways that there are a few different models, well, really two different models for how the government could use the uninhabited land to pay off the debt. Maybe the most obvious was to give the land to veterans instead of cash. That way you're solving two problems. You've nominally honored your debt to the veterans, and simultaneously you're expanding the territory occupied by American citizens.
Mm-hmm.
The early United States is...
And you have former soldiers on the frontier who could...
Yeah, now you get it. The early United States is very much in geopolitical competition with Britain, France, and Spain. And from Jefferson's perspective, giving white settlers their own farm properties, it's the whole thing anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Providing land bounties for war veterans was one of the driving reasons for the Hutchins Survey, but pretty quickly the federal government decided it wanted more land surveyed to distribute as bounties. So an area of Ohio north of the Hutchins Survey, that's this sort of middle yellow here on this map.
The United States Military District?
Yes. The U.S. Military District was established in 1796. Weirdly, the government decided to measure the ranges and townships in 5x5 mile grids.
As opposed to the 6x6s.
That they'd already started, yeah. So you can see it's just... Did I say north? I meant west of... It's just west of the Seven Ranges.
Yeah. So they just cut it smaller.
Yeah, so the individual... I guess the individual plots are going to be 1 mile by 1 mile still. But the townships are smaller.
Oh, I see.
They're 5x5. Then... There was also a big chunk of southern Ohio that was set aside for veterans, especially from Virginia. Or I should say specifically...
The Virginia Military District.
Yes. So this was part of the deal that the national government made with Virginia, similar to other deals that had nominal claims extending west. The compromise was that the national government would take on the states' war debts, and in exchange, those states would surrender their claims to western land. And part of the deal they made with Virginia was that they allocated additional land in Ohio for Virginia veterans. There was already a lot of land in Kentucky allocated for Virginia veterans because Kentucky had been part of Virginia, according to their claims.
Makes sense.
And because it was occupied by Virginians working off of their framework, it was surveyed using meets and bounds.
Right.
And actually, Kentucky and Tennessee were also surveyed using meets and bounds.
Just because, like, the people that were moving there did the surveying.
Yeah, exactly. I think they were just fine with that.
It looks more natural.
Yeah, and also
than
like
the rest of Ohio here.
Yeah. Well, and Ohio also is specifically like the surveying patchwork state of the country because
it's the test.
Because it's the testing area for all the different types of surveying. Exactly.
Refugee lands?
Oh, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Was up here?
Yep. Just between the military district, the Congress lands east of Scioto River. And
oh, yeah, there's a little stretch there. I actually didn't read on that, but I think I know what's up with it. So, the government's other strategy for making money off of the land was just to sell it off to a third party. There were a few land speculation companies set up for this purpose. For example, the Ohio Company was set up west of the Seven Ranges Survey. Even though it was a private venture, its main surveyor, Rufus Putnam, opted to use the 6x6 mile township and range system. The Ohio Company founded Marietta, Georgia, so let's find out where that is. There we go, there's Marietta, Georgia. My bad. The Ohio Company founded Marietta, Ohio, because we're looking at Ohio.
Okay,
why in my mind Marietta, Georgia is the only Marietta, but it is in fact Marietta, Ohio we're talking about, which was the headquarters of the Ohio Company. It was named after Marie Antoinette, actually.
And it's kind of like an embassy in that just within the township of Marietta, it's actually controlled by Georgia.
That seems right. That tracks. That just sounds right to me. It's an enclave or an exclave. It's an exclave of Georgia.
An exclave of Georgia. Yeah, subject only to their.
All Mariettas belong to the state of Georgia.
All right, Ohio Companies, Marietta, Ohio.
That's Ohio. Yes, indeed. Like the earlier Seven Ranges survey, Putnam's Ohio Company surveys turned out to be pretty sloppy, with lots of irregular angles. Although what we're looking at here, I think, are the individual plots, not the townships and ranges.
Yeah.
And anyway, the Ohio Company fizzled out when an alliance of Native American villages defeated the local U.S. Army.
Hell yeah.
I'd love to see it. The alliance called themselves the United Indian Nations and included Shawnee, Miami, and Lenape representatives, among others.
Hell yeah.
The Battle of the Wabash was the most spectacular defeat the U.S. Army ever suffered from Native American resistance.
Sick.
Both armies numbered around 1,000 combatants, but more than 600 U.S. soldiers were reported killed or captured after the battle. Overall, the U.S. Army had around 90% casualties, which is genuinely an insane number.
Yeah.
It was an actual scandal. The executive branch closed ranks, and the president refused to disclose classified documents. The House of Representatives, President Washington, that is, the House of Representatives launched a formal investigation into the Washington administration, but declined to take any action. Washington privately wrote, "We are involved in actual war," as if he was surprised that Native Americans would fight back. But back to the surveys.
What assumptions people make.
Back to my Eurocentric narrative. Back to that. Finally, I'm going to talk about the Connecticut Western Reserve. I mentioned earlier that land in Ohio was being used to pay off war debts, with the surveyed properties either being given as payment to debt holders or being sold off en masse to raise funds. Well, in the Western Reserve, we get a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. The fact that it was associated with Connecticut at all is due to the weirdness of pre-U.S. colonial borders. The East Coast states were set up as land grants given away by the King of England, and in many cases the borders were defined with some really vague language. So, for example, nobody really knew how far north Pennsylvania's border went, which led to an ongoing low-key state of conflict between Pennsylvania on the one hand and New York and Connecticut on the other. It eventually got resolved, with Connecticut getting cut off to the west. But the Connecticut colonists still claimed a strip of land to the west of Pennsylvania. It's the Connecticut Western Reserve.
It's like, all right, you can have that place that you're standing there, but out beyond it on the other side, that's still ours.
It's still ours. It's still ours. Exactly. You might recognize, say, Case Western Reserve University, which is named after the Western Reserve.
Oh. So Cleveland is secretly in Connecticut.
Cleveland is secretly Connecticut. I mean, it was a lot of the early colonists were from Connecticut. Or I should say a lot of the early settlers were Connecticut colonists.
Yes.
To pay off its war debt, Connecticut went ahead and sold off its Western Reserve to a land speculation company who started selling deeds.
Mm-hmm.
The Connecticut Land Company started surveying the area into the weird 5x5 mile townships, similar to the U.S. military district, but Connecticut's sale of the Western Reserve put the properties in a legal gray area. Because in 1800, a government committee found that Connecticut did not have the legal authority to sell its lands to a third party. Eventually, the national government took over the region, but decided to honor the land deeds that had already been sold. But the westernmost part, it's like these two counties here, around Sandusky, had a different fate. I had to mention it because it's called the Firelands.
The Firelands?
The Firelands. So the area around present-day Sandusky was set aside for refugees from Connecticut villages that had been destroyed during the war. So it became popularly known as the Firelands, as in the place where people whose homes had been burned down could move. So if I ever get out to the Cedar Point amusement park, I'm going to relentlessly tell everybody that I'm headed to the Firelands with no explanation offered.
That's very good.
Yes. And you should too.
If I ever go to Cedar Point, yes.
If you ever go to Cedar Point.
I think I went once as like a kid with a lot of family in Ohio.
And you would have had more fun if everyone knew it was the Firelands.
It's true.
Yes. So how successful was the land giveaway after all? It turns out that most people that were issued land in the Northwest Territory never moved there. There's a lot of risk associated with moving to the Northwest Territory in this period. Any would-be farmers moving out there were effectively isolated in hostile land. Transportation was generally slow and unreliable, especially during the winter. Farmers would be disconnected from markets, and there were raids from Native American tribes who, get this, really thought they ought to be able to live in their ancestral lands. Shocking.
Yeah, you moving out into someone else's yard, you do have to deal with them coming out wielding weapons.
Yes. So most of the would-be settlers ended up getting a pretty raw deal out of the arrangement. Often they would just sell their land bounties immediately to land speculators. Veterans who held out until 1830 were bailed out by the government and given government-issued scrip that they could exchange for land anywhere else that was available. We've established that there were a variety of schemes used for surveying and selling the land in Ohio. We had 6x6 township grids, 5x5 township grids, and even the old school meets and bounds system. By 1795, there seems to have been a large number of settlers heading west, demanding to buy land. At least that's how Congress perceived it. Although based on my reading, it's not clear to me whether this was an organic upswelling of demand from prospective free farmers, or if it was an actuality driven by land speculators. Maybe it was a combination of both. After all, the land speculators depend on demand from the small-time farmers in order to flip the properties and make a profit. Whichever it was, Congress saw the situation as urgent, so they hastily ordered continued surveying of Ohio using the existing methods from the Seven Ranges Survey. That means 6x6 mile township squares measured with the same fast and loose methods. As a matter of fact, the government selected Putnam, who had done the Ohio Company surveys, to do the new surveys.
Having proven to be so reliable.
He got land surveyed.
It's true.
For Putnam, it was more important that surveys happened quickly so that the land could immediately enter the market, which also matched Congress's priorities anyway.
So that's why we've got that little wedge in the Congress lands of over kind of in the eastern part of the Congress lands north of the Seven Ranges.
Yeah, I don't know when those got filled, and I don't know the history of that, but they were probably surveyed around this time.
Yeah. If you zoom in like to those Congress lands in the Seven Ranges, back to where we were, kind of over to the right a little bit. Look at that right in the middle.
This bump?
No, to the left.
Oh, yeah.
There.
That discontinuity,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's just a wedge. Like they took one range point and drew two lines from it.
Yeah, 100%. I think that would be where this range and this range met, and they just weren't lined up. Jefferson, on the other hand, was really dissatisfied with Putnam. First of all, the grid plan was Jefferson's baby, and he resented that it was being implemented in an inconsistent and irrational way. Second, Putnam was a Federalist who resented Jefferson to the extent that he called him the arch enemy to Washington's administration. So it's no surprise that once Jefferson becomes president in 1801, Putnam's time is soon to be cut short.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in 1803, which seems to have been the decisive factor, because Jefferson needed someone he could trust to do those surveys.
Mm-hmm.
The person he chose was Jared Mansfield. Mansfield had a similar academic background to Jefferson in that he was educated in mathematics in college. In fact, Mansfield actively published articles on algebra and geometry, as well as practical applications like navigation and gunnery. The blowing stuff up arts. Even before tapping him as a surveyor, Jefferson had appointed Mansfield to the faculty of West Point, the military college. Unlike Hutchins or Putnam, Mansfield had the scientific and technological background to draw the squares correctly.
How did he go about it?
Great question. Mansfield thought up a new method for surveying the grid systematically. The old way had been to simply pick a starting point, proceed from there, and then hope all the lines matched up later. The lines never matched up later. The inaccuracies would add up the further you got from the starting point. Mansfield's plan was to start with an origin point near the center of the survey. Then you could extend the baseline east and west from the origin, as well as a principal meridian north and south from the origin. Effectively, this is bringing us full circle, he took the concept of Newton's coordinate field and applied it to the landscape. He realized that before you can draw the points, you need to draw the axes. So as an example, how most of Illinois was surveyed, you can see the origin point is somewhere here in southern Illinois. There's a baseline that goes east and west, and then a third principal meridian, which was surveyed by Mansfield, which runs north and south through the state.
Mm-hmm.
So you're measuring all of your range and township lines from those two crossed lines. So at least they're consistent with that.
Yeah. And did they avoid the wandering angles?
They did a better job at avoiding the wandering angles. I think they had better navigational technology, but I don't understand it, so I didn't talk about it.
Okay. Sure.
There was still no practical way to encompass the entire continent with a single grid system, so the new surveys were created in chunks from east to west as the population expanded and the government sold off and gave away land. Still, under Mansfield, the chunks were bigger and more internally consistent than they had been in previous surveys. And I want to point out that this public land survey system continues until at least the 1950s in Alaska.
Wow.
So it was definitely an ongoing, slow-moving process. Another problem that Mansfield confronted is one that you've probably been thinking about this whole time, since I've been using a curved Earth to model these maps, which is that the Earth is a globe. I'm making the bold stance of declaring Chicagoland as a non-flat Earth podcast.
Oh, getting controversial here.
That's the most controversial thing I've said.
Mm-hmm.
So if you follow two parallel lines of longitude north on the globe, you'll find out they're not actually parallel because they gradually get closer until they converge at the North Pole. So
Yeah.
even as Jefferson and Mansfield were imposing a square grid on the land, they were well aware that you can't actually wrap a square grid around a sphere without warping it. So in my head, I'm just imagining wrapping a basketball in wrapping paper, because you can kind of do it for a few inches and then it just starts folding or ripping or whatever.
Yeah. And on the scale of even the bounds then of the United States, that's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah, absolutely unavoidable. So Mansfield's solution was to accommodate the Earth's curvature using a slight correction. Periodically, the range lines would be redrawn starting at the principal meridian. Right, so the principal meridian I'm looking at Iowa right now. Let's put that on. The range lines in the principal meridian in Iowa is somewhere over here between Dubuque and Iowa City. And you can see that to the west of that, there's places where there's discontinuities between the township lines. And the further you get from that principal meridian, the more out of line they get. So some of the east-west township lines are effectively a discontinuity where the range lines to the north and south of the township do not match up. And since the township and range lines are often used for county roads in rural areas, it's pretty common for roads running north to south along a range to end up having a little jog or even a T-junction at their intersections. So Mansfield's correction was not a very elegant solution, but he got the job done.
Yeah, and then it stays fairly consistent going latitudinally, but then has those
Yeah.
Is that like every 10?
It's about every 10, yeah. I think there was some rule about if the northern border of the township was less than... If the northern border of the township was more than 60 yards shorter, or maybe feet, shorter than the south border because they're taller, they're narrower on the top than the bottom. Once it reached a certain point, he would reset the measurement of ranges from the principal meridian. I didn't totally understand that rule, but that's what I read.
I think I understand.
But you look at it and you say, oh, I see, every once in a while, they just don't line up. Okay.
Starts getting too narrow. Yeah. All right. So we're rolling. We're rolling over rivers and valleys and
Oh yeah.
Any semblance of geographical feature.
Yeah, we've totally defeated it. But this is also at this point we're on the plains, so it's like tall grass and short grass prairie.
Yeah.
Or like mostly tall grass and mixed prairie here in Iowa. So it's like, okay, the rivers are not that large. Those are the main geographical boundaries that are difficult to sort of just steamroll over. I mean, obviously, when you get down to a local level, I'm sure you're going to see all sorts of weird things that don't make any, that roads that go over hills when they could have gone around them and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So that's where we'll leave the story for now. Alas, in our first episode of Chicagoland, I have not even gotten to Chicago. That means you'll have to come back for our next episode, where we'll learn how Jefferson and Mansfield's universal grid got parceled out into the farms and cities of the Midwest. So, it's been a pleasure having you on, Soma.
It's been a pleasure hearing about grids and colonialism and the philosophical underpinnings of genocides.
There it is. It's such a pleasure. That's why I'm smiling. Where can the good people listening catch your stuff?
Okay, well, there's Stone Succubus, the band. We are Stone Succubus Band on Instagram. Yeah, and then I'm Somatosensation on Instagram. That's the sensation of touch is called somatosensation. If you just Google it, it'll spell
I know.
correctly.
I got this. I got that. I got this. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna type tomato sensation, one word, and then you're gonna delete the T at the beginning and replace it with an S. Easy. All right. Catch you all next
Yes, the
time. Bye
sensation of
bye.
tomatoes. Catch you next time.
You've been listening to Chicagoland, a production by Articulata Publishing. Chicagoland is written, edited, and produced by Xavier only. The Chicagoland theme was composed by Chris Robbin. That's ChrisRobbin.